Imagine coming home from serving your country, only to find the house you grew up in, filled with decades of memories, reduced to rubble. That's exactly what happened to General James Carter when his own HOA president, Karen Matthews, decided his historic family home was too outdated and needed demolition, all while he was deployed overseas defending our freedom. But this isn't just a story about property violations or greedy HOAs. It's a tale of betrayal, resilience, and justice served cold. Karen thought she could exploit James's absence, cashing in on her husband's shady construction deals while hiding behind fake permits and falsified documents. What she didn't count on: a decorated U.S. Army general with battle-tested strategies, a network of powerful allies, including a certain senator, and an unshakable determination to protect not only his home but every military family targeted by predatory HOAs. From secret recordings to explosive courtroom revelations, this real-life drama unfolds like a thriller you won't believe actually happened. And it's not over yet. James is now leading a nationwide movement to stop HOA corruption once and for all. If you're ready for jaw-dropping twists, shocking betrayals, and ultimate redemption, hit that subscribe button right now and join the fight against HOA bullies. Welcome to Real HOA Drama, where every story is stranger than fiction. The Virginia suburbs were supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where quiet mornings stretched into lazy afternoons, where neighbors exchanged polite waves over white picket fences. But that illusion shattered one crisp autumn morning when I first noticed Karen Matthews circling James Carter's historic colonial home like a hawk eyeing its prey. James, my cousin by marriage and a decorated U.S. Army general, was thousands of miles away serving his country, leaving behind not just a house but a legacy, for generations of Carters had lived within those walls. The house wasn't just brick and mortar. It was history itself, standing tall through wars, weddings, and whispered family secrets. Yet here was Karen, clipboard in hand, her designer workout gear immaculate despite the dew-kissed grass beneath her feet. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped rhythmically against her phone screen as she documented what she called violations. Violations? Really? I stepped out onto my porch, coffee mug still warm in my grip, watching her from across the street. It wasn't the first time I'd seen her lurking around James's property, but something about this morning felt different, more deliberate. She didn't even try to hide what she was doing, snapping photos of the paint color. 2 shades off regulation, she muttered under her breath, and pointing dramatically at the hedges, which looked perfectly trimmed to me. When she pulled out a measuring tape to check the height of the bushes, I couldn't take it anymore. "Excuse me, Karen," I called out, crossing the street with forced casualness. "What exactly are you doing?" She turned, her smile so practiced it could have cracked glass. "Oh, good morning, Charlie," she chirped, though there was nothing remotely cheerful about her tone. "Just documenting some serious maintenance issues. Did you know these hedges are half an inch above HOA standards?" Half an inch. As if the fate of civilization depended on it. "James is literally serving our country right now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This house has been in our family for decades. The paint was approved 3 years ago by the previous board." Karen tilted her head, her expression smug. "Rules change, dear." She typed something into her phone, her fingers moving with precision. "And deployment is no excuse for letting property values drop. You should know, we're considering proposals to increase home values by 30%. That stopped me cold. Proposals? What proposals? Before I could press further, she breezed past me, her perfume lingering like a warning. Something wasn't right. Not right at all. Later that day, I found myself staring at HOA meeting minutes I dug up online. Buried deep in the notes was a proposal for a state-of-the-art community center, right where James's house stood. My stomach churned. This wasn't about hedges or paint colors. This was personal. And Karen Matthews? She wasn't just power-hungry. She was playing a game, and James's absence made him an easy target. I locked James's front door that night, unable to shake the feeling that trouble was brewing, and we were running out of time. It started as a trickle, but quickly turned into a flood. Certified letters began arriving at James's house like clockwork, each one more absurd than the last. The brass knocker that had survived 2 world wars? Suddenly deemed non-compliant. The rose bushes his daughter planted before he deployed? Now classified as invasive species. It was as if Karen Matthews had declared open season on everything James held dear, all while he was thousands of miles away serving his country. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about property values or community aesthetics. It was personal. And then, late one sleepless night, I found the smoking gun buried deep in the HOA meeting minutes. I'd spent hours poring over those documents, my laptop glowing faintly in the dim light of my kitchen. At first glance, they seemed innocuous enough, boring bureaucratic jargon about landscaping regulations and mailbox heights. But tucked away in the notes from last month's meeting was something that made my blood run cold, a proposal for a state-of-the-art community center right where James's house stood. Not just any community center. Mind you, a sprawling complex complete with a gym, yoga studios, and luxury condos. The kind of project that could line someone's pockets with gold. Someone like Tom Matthews, Karen's husband, whose construction company conveniently happened to be named as the preferred contractor. The pieces clicked together faster than I wanted them to. Every violation notice, every snide comment Karen made during her morning inspections, it all pointed back to this. They weren't targeting James because his paint color was slightly off or because his hedges were half an inch too tall. No, this was about greed, pure and simple. And the worst part? There was nothing I could do to stop it, not alone anyway. Desperate, I tried calling James again. This time, I even resorted to sending encrypted emails through the military portal, hoping against hope that he'd see them. But deployment zones have a way of swallowing messages whole, leaving you staring at your screen wondering if your words will ever reach their destination. All I got in response was silence, crushing, suffocating silence. Meanwhile, the HOA board members drove by daily, clipboard in hand, taking notes like vultures circling prey. I swear, I caught Tom himself measuring the property line at midnight, flashlight in one hand and a tape measure in the other. That's when I knew we were running out of time. One evening, unable to sit idly by, I installed security cameras around James's property. If Karen thought she could sneak around under cover of darkness, she was dead wrong. Sure enough, the footage captured her leading a group of suited investors on a walking tour of our block. She gestured dramatically toward James's house, her voice carrying just enough for me to overhear. "This entire area will be transformed," she announced, her tone dripping with smug satisfaction. "Outdated structures will be removed starting with that eyesore." She didn't need to point. I already knew exactly which eyesore she meant. That night, I called Sarah, James's daughter, who was away at college. Her voice trembled as I explained what was happening. "But Dad's supposed to be home in 2 weeks," she said, her words barely above a whisper. "They can't just take our house, can they? All our family photos are there. Mom's garden." I wanted to reassure her, to tell her everything would be fine, but the truth was, I didn't know anymore. Karen had already survived 3 lawsuits from other homeowners. She knew how to work the system, exploiting loopholes and burying opponents under mountains of legal jargon. As I hung up the phone, another certified letter arrived. The HOA was calling an emergency meeting tomorrow night to vote on the community center proposal. My stomach sank when I read the fine print. They'd scheduled it exactly 13 days before James's return date. 1 day short of the 2-week notice required for deployed service members under federal law. Karen had done her homework, and I realized with growing horror that this wasn't just about property values or shiny new developments. This was personal, and she'd been planning it for months. As I locked James's front door that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that these might be the last few hours this house would still belong to our family. On the wall, a photo of James receiving his first command caught my eye. He used to say that battles are won with strategy, not just strength. Standing there in the quiet, I felt a spark of determination ignite within me. Karen thought she was playing chess, but she had no idea who or what she was up against. Little did she know, I was already forming a battle plan of my own. The phone rang just as I was finishing my late-night coffee. On the other end was Sarah Carter, James's daughter, and one of the brightest kids I'd ever met, but her voice trembled like a leaf caught in a storm. "Charlie," she whispered, "is Dad's house okay? I've been having nightmares about it." Her fear wasn't unfounded. Every time I closed my eyes, I could picture Karen Matthews standing on James's porch, clipboard in hand, plotting its destruction like some kind of suburban dictator. "It's still standing for now," I replied, trying to sound reassuring while my stomach churned at the thought of what might happen next. Sarah's voice cracked when she mentioned the family photos tucked away in the attic, the ones documenting 4 generations of Carters under that roof. "Mom planted those rose bushes herself before Dad left," she said softly. "If they take the house, they're taking everything we have left of her." The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about bricks and mortar anymore, it was about memories, love, and legacy. And yet, here we were, fighting against someone who saw James's home not as a sanctuary, but as a blank slate for profit. That same night, unable to shake the feeling that something sinister was brewing, I decided to stake out James's property. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a thermos of coffee, I parked my car across the street and waited. At first, all I heard was the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of crickets. But then, around midnight, I spotted movement near the edge of James's yard. There he was, Tom Matthews, Karen's husband, sneaking around like a kid breaking curfew. He had a flashlight in one hand and a measuring tape in the other, jotting down notes with a kind of precision that screamed guilty conscience. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly to myself. Who measures property lines at midnight unless they're up to no good? It was almost comical, if it weren't so infuriating. By the time I got home, I knew I needed evidence if we were going to stand a chance against Karen and her crew. So, bright and early the next morning, I installed security cameras around James's house. If Tom wanted to play detective, I'd make sure he starred in his own reality show, one that would air in federal court if things went south. But the real heartbreak came later that week when I started talking to our neighbors. Mrs. Chun, the elderly woman next door, invited me over for tea. She sat me down at her kitchen table, her hands shaking as she handed me a stack of old letters. "They tried to force us out last summer," she admitted, tears welling up in her eyes. "Said our garden gnomes were destroying property values." "Can you believe that?" I stared at her collection of ceramic gnomes, quirky, colorful, and utterly harmless, and felt a surge of anger. These weren't just threats. They were personal attacks designed to break people down until they gave up their homes. Then there was Bill, the mailman who'd lived here for 20 years. He told me how Karen had sent violation notices to 3 other deployed service members' families, accusing them of everything from peeling paint to excessive holiday decorations. One family lost their home because they didn't respond fast enough to her ridiculous demands. Another moved out after receiving daily visits from HOA inspectors who showed up unannounced, claiming they needed to assess structural integrity. Each story made my blood boil hotter than the last. How many lives had been ruined by this woman's greed? As I pieced together these accounts, I realized something important. Karen wasn't just targeting James. She was targeting anyone she thought wouldn't fight back. Deployed soldiers, elderly couples, single parents. They were all fair game in her twisted game of real estate chess. And yet, despite the fear gripping our community, no one dared to speak up. They were too scared of retaliation, too afraid of being labeled troublemakers. But deep down, I knew they wanted justice, not just for James, but for themselves. All they needed was someone brave enough to light the fuse. That's when I decided to act. Using the footage from the security cameras and the stories I'd gathered, I created a dossier that would make any lawyer proud. Every violation notice, every threatening email, every shady deal between Karen and her husband's construction company, it was all there, meticulously documented. I even included a timeline showing how quickly the HOA moved to demolish properties once they found out the owners were deployed. It was clear as day. This wasn't about rules or regulations. This was about power, money, and control. By the time I finished compiling the evidence, dawn was breaking over the horizon. The sky glowed pink and orange, casting long shadows across James's yard. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what victory might look like, a neighborhood united, a corrupt HOA dismantled, and James's house standing tall once again. But I also knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Karen didn't get where she was by playing fair, and she wouldn't go down without a fight. Still, as I locked James's front door behind me, I felt a spark of hope ignite within me. We weren't just protecting a house, we were defending a home. And sometimes, that makes all the difference. The morning started like any other, quiet, unassuming, the kind where you expect nothing more than a cup of coffee and maybe some small talk with your neighbor over the fence. But then came the sound that shattered everything, the low rumble of engines, heavy and menacing, rolling down our sleepy suburban street at 6:30 a.m. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding as I threw on the first pair of shoes I could find. Through my bedroom window, I saw them, 3 yellow bulldozers and a massive dump truck, lined up like an invading army outside James's house. My stomach dropped. This was it. They were actually going to do it. By the time I got outside, still in my pajamas, Karen Matthews was already there, looking every bit the part of a power-hungry HOA dictator in her designer workout clothes. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped away on her iPad, her lips curled into that infuriatingly fake smile she always wore when she thought she'd won. 2 police cars idled nearby, their officers leaning casually against the doors, clearly instructed not to interfere unless things got physical. "Stop," I shouted, waving the folder of legal documents I'd been keeping close since this nightmare began. "This house belongs to an active service member. You can't do this." My hands trembled as I held up the power of attorney papers James had given me before he deployed. Karen didn't even glance up from her screen. Instead, she laughed, a cold, hollow sound, and kept tapping away. "Oh, sweetie," she said without looking at me, "the board had an emergency meeting last night. We voted unanimously to proceed with immediate demolition due to severe structural issues." Her voice dripped with smug satisfaction, like she'd spent weeks rehearsing those lines in front of a mirror. Finally, she looked up, her eyes colder than the winter wind slicing through my thin pajama shirt. "It's all perfectly legal," she added with a smirk. "We even have a city inspector's report." I felt sick. What inspector? I'd been here every single day, watching over James's property like it was my own. The demolition crew chief approached cautiously, avoiding eye contact. I shoved James_D CLS tax receipts into his hands. "Look," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "Everything's paid up. They can't do this." Karen stepped between us, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "Actually," she drawled, pulling out a thick folder stuffed with paperwork, "we haven't received any tax payments for 6 months. Such a shame." She waved a hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "We sent multiple notices. I guess they got lost in the mail, to wherever your cousin is stationed." My blood boiled. With shaking fingers, I pulled up my phone's banking app. There they were, 6 canceled checks made out to the HOA, each one cleared by their own bank. "You cashed these checks," I snapped, shoving the proof in her face. Karen waved me off like I was nothing more than an annoying mosquito buzzing around her head. "Those were applied to other outstanding violations," she said breezily, ticking off items on her clipboard. "Overgrown grass, unauthorized paint color, non-compliant mailbox height." Each ridiculous accusation fueled my anger, but it was the deafening roar of the bulldozer engines growing louder behind me that nearly broke me. Frantically, I dialed James's lawyer. "Pick up, pick up, pick up," I muttered under my breath as the phone rang endlessly. Voicemail. Of course. By now, neighbors had begun gathering, drawn by the commotion. Most stayed back, unsure of what to do or say, but old Mrs. Chin shuffled forward, her phone held high as she recorded everything. "I remember when James's grandparents built this house," she declared loudly, glaring daggers at Karen. "Right after he came back from Korea. The whole neighborhood helped." Karen shot her an icy glare, but Mrs. Chin didn't flinch. If anything, she stood taller, her frail frame radiating defiance. That's when it happened. The moment I'll never forget. The bulldozer claw rose slowly, its metal teeth glinting ominously in the pale morning light. And then, with a sickening crunch, it took its first bite out of James's colonial home. The sound was unbearable, like hearing bones snap. Splinters of wood flew everywhere, and shards of stained glass rained down onto the lawn like broken dreams. I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. That porch swing where James used to sit with his daughter, teaching her how to read, gone. The window of the room where his late wife spent her final days obliterated. It was as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to my chest. Behind me, Karen was already on her phone, speaking in hushed tones. "Yes, honey, they're starting now. Make sure your crew is ready to break ground for the community center next week. The permits? Don't worry about those. I've got it all handled." Her words barely registered over the deafening roar of destruction. As the bulldozer clawed deeper into the wreckage, I prayed James would get here in time. What I didn't know then was that Karen's perfect plan was about to blow up in her face, in ways none of us could have imagined. The sound of my phone ringing shattered the chaos around me like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. I fumbled to answer it, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped the device. On the screen was James's face, his uniform crisp, his expression calm but curious. For a moment, I forgot where I was, standing amidst the wreckage of his home with bulldozers still growling behind me. "Hey, cousin," he said cheerfully, oblivious to the disaster unfolding on his property. "You'll never believe this, but I managed to catch an early flight. Just landed at the airport. Thought I'd surprise everyone." My throat tightened as I stared at the bulldozer claw tearing through what used to be his front porch, the same porch where we drank lemonade every summer, where his daughter Emma learned to read, where his late wife spent her final days looking out at the garden she'd planted. How could I tell him that the house he'd left behind just weeks ago was now being reduced to rubble? "James," I choked out, my voice cracking under the weight of everything I needed to say. But before I could form the words, the sickening crunch of wood splitting echoed through the air. James must have heard it too, because his cheerful tone faltered. "What's going on?" he asked sharply, all traces of casualness gone. "Charlie, what's that noise?" His voice hardened, the kind of commanding edge that made soldiers snap to attention. I turned toward the destruction, watching helplessly as the bulldozer claw took another vicious bite out of our family's history. The beautiful stained glass window from 1962, the one Grandma had picked out herself, shattered into a million pieces, scattering across the lawn like broken dreams. "They're demolishing your house," I blurted, tears streaming down my face. "Karen, she's here. She says it's legal. They've got permits, inspectors, everything." "James," I tried to stop them, but they wouldn't listen. My words tumbled out in a rush, each syllable heavier than the last. For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line, so thick it felt suffocating. Then came the question I dreaded most. "Where are my letters? The ones Emma sent me while I was deployed?" I froze, my heart sinking deeper than I thought possible. Those letters, carefully handwritten notes filled with love, hope, and updates about school, had been stored in a wooden box on his desk. Now they were buried somewhere beneath splintered wood and shattered glass. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, James. I couldn't save them." There was a pause, and when James spoke again, his voice was ice cold, but not directed at me. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, every word clipped and precise. "Don't let anyone touch anything else until I get there. And call Senator Williams. Tell him I need him here," I said. Before I could respond, he hung up, leaving me staring at the phone in stunned silence. As I dialed the senator's office, I couldn't help but glance back at Karen, who was now pacing nervously near her car, clutching her designer purse like it might somehow protect her from whatever storm was about to hit. She hadn't seen James yet, but I knew the moment she did, her perfect little world would collapse faster than the walls of his house. Behind her, the demolition crew had slowed their work, sensing that something, or someone, was about to change the game entirely. By the time I relayed the message to Senator Williams, James's SUV roared onto the scene, skidding to a stop inches from Karen's Mercedes. The look on his face as he stepped out of the vehicle sent chills down my spine, and judging by the way Karen's smile faltered, she felt it too. Gone was the warm, easygoing cousin I'd grown up with. In his place stood General James Carter, decorated war hero and master strategist, ready to fight for what mattered most. As he surveyed the ruins of his home, his jaw clenched, and his eyes burned with a quiet fury that promised retribution. Whatever Karen thought she'd accomplished today, she was about to discover just how wrong she'd been to mess with the wrong veteran. The moment James stepped out of his SUV, the air seemed to crackle with electricity. His uniform was immaculate, every star, every medal gleaming under the morning sun, as if he'd just stepped off a parade ground instead of racing home from the airport after learning his family's legacy was being torn apart. The bulldozer operator froze mid-swing, his hand hovering over the controls like it might burst into flames if he dared move another inch. Even Karen, who had spent weeks orchestrating this demolition with the precision of a chess grandmaster, looked as though she'd seen a ghost. James didn't yell. He didn't scream or throw accusations. Instead, he walked toward the wreckage of his home with the calm authority of a man who'd faced down warlords and dictators. Each step echoed against the pavement, louder than the rumble of the idling bulldozers. When he finally stopped in front of Karen, her perfectly styled hair seemed to wilt under his gaze. "Ma'am," he said, his voice so cold it could have frosted glass, "I believe you're standing on my property." Karen fumbled for words, clutching her clipboard like it might shield her from whatever storm was about to hit. "General Carter." "What a surprise," she stammered, her usual smug confidence crumbling faster than the walls of James's house. "We had no idea you'd be back so soon. But rest assured, everything we've done here is completely legal. We followed all proper procedures." She waved her HMA papers around like a magician trying to distract an audience from the trick they were about to uncover. James didn't blink. Instead, he pulled a weathered document from his briefcase, a deed signed by his grandfather in 1947, the ink faded but the intent clear as day. "This land has been in my family for 4 generations," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut steel. "And I'm curious, when exactly did the HOA acquire the right to demolish it?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could utter a word, James held up a hand, silencing her instantly. It wasn't a request, it was a command. And everyone present, including the police officers lingering awkwardly nearby, knew better than to interrupt. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, pressing a single number on speed dial. "Bill?" "Yes, it's James. Remember that talk we had about local government overreach?" He paused, his eyes locked onto Karen's increasingly pale face. "Well, you won't believe what I'm looking at right now. Yes, that property, the one my grandfather willed to me. The one protected under the Service Members Civil Relief Act." Karen's designer heels shifted nervously beneath her as realization dawned. Her perfect plan wasn't just unraveling, it was exploding right in her face. By the time James hung up, news vans were already pulling onto the street, their satellite dishes glinting in the sunlight. Reporters poured out like ants at a picnic, microphones and cameras ready to capture every word. Within minutes, the quiet suburban neighborhood had transformed into a media circus. Senator Williams himself arrived not long after, marching up the driveway with the kind of purpose usually reserved for congressional hearings. "Get me the state attorney general," he barked into his phone, barely glancing at the rubble that used to be James's home. Karen, now visibly sweating despite the crisp autumn air, tried one last desperate gambit. "This is a private HOA matter," she squeaked, waving her rulebook like a talisman. But no one was listening anymore. Not the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, not the neighbors filming everything on their phones, and certainly not James, who stood calmly amidst the chaos, collecting evidence with the methodical precision of a seasoned battlefield strategist. As the forensics team began sifting through the debris, James knelt beside what remained of his daughter's bedroom. Picking up a shattered photo frame, he carefully placed it into an evidence bag. This was Emma's 6th birthday, he explained softly to the growing crowd of neighbors. She wanted to be an astronaut. The sight of him cradling the broken pieces of his life struck a chord deep within everyone watching. This wasn't just a house, it was a testament to love, sacrifice, and service. And Karen Matthews had no idea what she'd unleashed by messing with the wrong veteran. The bombshell dropped just as Karen was trying to explain away her husband's presence at the scene. A young intern from Senator Williams' office, a wiry college kid named Alex with a laptop perpetually balanced on one arm, came sprinting across the lawn like he'd just uncovered buried treasure. "Sir, you need to see this," he shouted, waving a stack of papers so thick it looked like they'd raided a library. James raised an eyebrow but motioned for him to proceed. By now, the crowd had grown significantly. Neighbors clutching cell phones, reporters jockeying for better angles, and even a few curious kids perched on bicycles at the edge of the chaos. Alex flipped open his laptop, tapping furiously before spinning it around to face James. On the screen were blueprints, detailed, polished plans for the community center that Karen had been dreaming about for months. The kicker? They were dated 2 months before the HOA board had supposedly voted to approve the project. "We found these in public records," Alex explained breathlessly. "Turns out Tom's construction company didn't just win the bid. They submitted it 3 months ago, long before anyone even mentioned demolishing your house." Karen's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up toward her hairline, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. For once, she was speechless. Her husband, Tom, fared no better. His face turned a shade of red I'd only ever seen on cartoon characters. He tried to slink back toward his Mercedes, but a police officer casually stepped into his path, clipboard in hand. "Stay right there, sir," the officer said politely, though there was nothing polite about the way he loomed over Tom like a storm cloud. That's when the floodgates opened. Neighbors who had spent years living in fear of Karen's wrath finally found their voices. Bill, our longtime mailman, stepped forward holding his phone aloft like Excalibur. "I recorded this yesterday," he announced, pressing play. The video showed Karen and Tom walking around James's property at dawn, measuring distances and arguing over where the gym would go. "They were planning this for weeks," Bill added, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Before any vote happened." Mrs. Chun, bless her heart, shuffled forward next, clutching a shoebox filled with old letters and emails. "She sent me violation notices too," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "Claimed my gnomes were destroying property values." Someone in the crowd snickered, but Mrs. Chin didn't notice, or didn't care. She handed the box to James, who accepted it with the solemnity of a man receiving sacred relics. Inside were copies of certified mail receipts proving Karen had received James's tax payments and promptly hidden them. But the piece de resistance came when Sarah, James's teenage daughter, walked up holding her phone. Her expression was calm, almost eerily composed, as she played a recording of Karen's own voice. "Don't worry about the paperwork," Karen's voice sneered. "Just tear it down before he gets back. We'll sort out the details later." The audio crackled faintly, but every word was crystal clear. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Even the reporters stopped typing mid-sentence, their jaws slack with disbelief. By now, the state attorney general himself had arrived, flanked by FBI agents whose suits were so sharp they could cut glass. One glance at the scene, and he barked orders like a general leading troops into battle. "Get those blueprints," he snapped. "And someone get me a warrant for their personal devices." Within minutes, Karen and Tom were being led away in handcuffs, their designer clothes looking more pathetic than powerful under the harsh glare of flashing cameras. 6 other HOA board members followed shortly after, their faces pale and sweaty as they stumbled into waiting squad cars. As the dust settled, or rather, as the chaos shifted into controlled pandemonium, I watched James stand quietly amidst it all. He wasn't gloating or shouting or demanding justice. Instead, he knelt beside what remained of his daughter's bedroom wall, carefully collecting fragments of Emma's NASA posters and placing them into evidence bags. Each piece told a story, not just of loss, but of resilience. "This isn't about revenge," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." And yet, as Karen was shoved into the back of a police car, screaming about how this is ridiculous, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. Justice might be blind, but sometimes it wore combat boots. And today, it marched straight down our suburban street, leaving a trail of truth in its wake. Little did we know, this was only the beginning. The real fight was just getting started. It wasn't just James's house that was being rebuilt, it was hope itself. Within days of Karen's arrest, our quiet suburban neighborhood transformed into a hive of activity unlike anything I'd ever seen. Veterans from 3 different states rolled up their sleeves alongside local carpenters, electricians, and plumbers who volunteered their time and skills. The air buzzed with the sound of hammers pounding nails, saws slicing through wood, and laughter, so much laughter, as people worked side by side under the autumn sun. James stood at the center of it all, directing operations like the seasoned leader he was, though his uniform had been swapped for jeans and a flannel shirt. He didn't need medals or stars on his shoulders to command respect. Everyone there knew they were building something far greater than walls and roofs. The new house rose steadily, its colonial design nearly identical to the original but stronger, sturdier, built not just with bricks and mortar, but with love and gratitude. Neighbors brought food every day, casseroles, pies, sandwiches, and set them out on folding tables in what would soon become the backyard. Mrs. Chun baked her famous ginger cookies, which disappeared faster than anyone could keep track. Even Bill, our mailman-turned-unlikely hero, showed up one morning with a stack of old photographs he'd salvaged from the wreckage of James's first home. "Thought these might belong here," he said gruffly, handing them over. James nodded silently, his eyes glistening as he tucked the photos into a box labeled Memories Worth Saving. But the most powerful moment came when the land earmarked for Karen's luxury community center officially became Memorial Park. A group of high school students organized a fundraiser, selling T-shirts emblazoned with the slogan, "Honor, Serve, Protect." Local businesses donated playground equipment, picnic tables, and even a small stage where veterans could share their stories during annual celebrations. On opening day, the entire community gathered around a newly erected monument honoring those who had served, James's name among them. As Sarah pressed her palm against the cool stone, whispering something only she could hear, I realized this park wasn't just a tribute to the past. It was a promise for the future, a place where families could gather, children could play, and no one would forget the sacrifices made by those who wore the uniform. Meanwhile, James and I turned our attention to something bigger, the Homeowners Defense Alliance. What started as a late-night brainstorming session over coffee evolved into a nationwide movement aimed at protecting military families from predatory HOAs. With James's connections in Washington and my knack for documenting corruption, thanks to Karen, we created a network of advocates ready to fight back against injustice. Every week, more veterans joined our cause, sharing their own horror stories of HOAs trying to exploit their absences while they served overseas. One Army nurse in Texas called us after her HOA fined her $100 per day for keeping a flagpole her late father had installed before she deployed. Within hours, James had drafted letters, I'd sent emails, and suddenly that HOA board wasn't so eager to pick a fight anymore. Word spread quickly, and soon we weren't just defending homes. We were creating precedents. And then there was Karen's daughter, Emily, who surprised us all by volunteering to help transition the first families moving into the affordable housing project James funded on the abandoned community center land. She showed up one Saturday morning clutching a toolbox, her designer sneakers replaced with scuffed work boots. "I want to make things right," she said simply, her voice steady despite the weight of her family's mistakes. Watching her hammer nails alongside James's teenage daughter, Sophie, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe redemption was possible after all. By the time winter arrived, James's new home stood tall and proud, its porch adorned with a handmade sign reading "Welcome Home." Inside, a shadow box displayed fragments of the old house, a piece of Emma's ballet trophy, shards of stained glass, and even a splintered chunk of the front door where James used to teach Sarah how to unlock deadbolts safely. Each relic told a story, not of loss, but of resilience. And outside, in the park that should have been condos, children laughed as they swung higher and higher, their giggles carried by the wind like whispers of gratitude. Sometimes, losing your home teaches you what truly matters. For James, it wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about justice, community, and ensuring no other family had to endure what we did. As I sat on the newly built porch, watching Sophie twirl in the yard like a ballerina beneath the stars, I knew one thing for certain. Karen Matthews may have tried to destroy us, but instead, she gave us the tools to build something unbreakable. It was a quiet afternoon when Emily Matthews first showed up at James's new front door. She stood there awkwardly, clutching a dusty shoebox like it might crumble in her hands if she held it too tightly. Her designer sneakers were scuffed, evidence that she'd walked a long way to get here, and her usually immaculate hair hung loose around her face, giving her an uncharacteristic air of vulnerability. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The last time I'd seen Emily, she was standing beside her mother during the demolition, silent but complicit as Karen barked orders to the bulldozer crew.
But now?
Now she looked different. "I'm sorry," she blurted out before James could even invite her inside. "I didn't know what they were doing, not really anyway. Not until it was too late." Her voice trembled, and she glanced down at the box in her arms like it might somehow explain everything. "These are yours," she added softly, holding it out toward James. "I saved them from the dumpster after, well, you know." James hesitated for a beat, then took the box carefully, as though handling fragile glass. Inside were dozens of photographs, yellowed Polaroids, faded snapshots, and even a few black and white prints that told the story of his family across generations. There was one of his grandparents standing proudly in front of the original house, another of his late wife tending to her garden, and several of Sarah as a toddler, grinning ear to ear while covered in mud. Each photo felt like a piece of a puzzle being put back together after years of chaos. Emily shifted uncomfortably on the porch, clearly unsure whether she should stay or leave. "Mom never told me these existed," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "If I had known sooner," she trailed off, shaking her head. "Anyway, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for all of it. And maybe try to make things right." For a long moment, James simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Over coffee, Emily opened up about how guilty she'd felt watching her parents orchestrate the destruction of James's home. "I used to think Mom was invincible," she confessed, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "But seeing what happened, to your house, to our family, it made me realize how wrong she was. About everything." By the end of their conversation, something remarkable had happened. Emily asked if she could help. Not just with rebuilding James's life, but with repairing the damage her parents had caused throughout the community. Within days, she began volunteering at Memorial Park, planting trees and helping organize events for veterans' families. On weekends, she joined Sarah and Sophie in sorting through donations for the affordable housing project James had funded on the abandoned community center land. Slowly but surely, Emily became part of the solution rather than the problem. And yet, despite her genuine efforts, not everyone was quick to trust her. Old Mrs. Chun, bless her heart, gave Emily a frosty glare every time she passed by. "That girl's still a Matthews," she muttered under her breath one afternoon while pruning her beloved gnomes. But Bill, our ever-wise mailman, saw things differently. "People can change," he said simply, handing Emily a flyer for the upcoming Veterans Day celebration. "Sometimes, redemption starts with showing up." As the weeks turned into months, Emily proved herself time and again. She worked tirelessly alongside Sarah to create a digital archive of the salvaged photos, ensuring no memory would be lost again. She spoke publicly at HOA meetings, urging stricter oversight to prevent predatory practices against military families. And perhaps most poignantly, she helped design a mural for Memorial Park, a vibrant tribute to service members featuring silhouettes of soldiers, sailors, and pilots marching beneath the words "Freedom isn't free." One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the park, Emily approached James with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the laughter of children playing nearby. "For letting me be part of this. For giving me a chance to fix things." James smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Redemption isn't given, Emily," he said gently. "It's earned, and you've been earning it every single day." In that moment, watching Emily nod through her tears, I realized something important. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about transformation, the kind that heals wounds instead of reopening them. And as Emily walked away to join Sarah and Sophie, who were busy stringing fairy lights around the park pavilion, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the unexpected gift of second chances. After all, sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, they're forged in moments of grace. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. If anything, it had only just begun. James spent his mornings now hunched over a map of the United States, pins marking every town where another military family had been targeted by predatory HOAs. Each pin told a story. A Navy pilot whose home was foreclosed while he flew missions overseas. A Marine widow slapped with fines because her late husband's mailbox was half an inch too tall. A Coast Guard reservist forced to sell at a loss after months of harassment over chipped paint. It was maddening, infuriating, and yet, somehow, inspiring too. Because for every injustice, there was also a glimmer of hope. People ready to stand up, speak out, and fight back. Senator Williams had delivered on his promise, introducing legislation that would become known as the Matthews Act. Its name was no accident, a deliberate reminder that even the most corrupt systems could be dismantled when someone dared to challenge them. The bill sailed through Congress with bipartisan support, thanks in part to James's testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee. He didn't rant or rave during his speech. Instead, he held up a single photograph, Sophie, his granddaughter, standing proudly beside the shadow box that preserved fragments of their old home. "This isn't about property values," he'd said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "It's about protecting the families who protect us all." But passing laws wasn't enough, not for James. While others celebrated victory, he rolled up his sleeves and got back to work. Our dining room transformed into a command center once again, this time filled with volunteers from across the country. Lawyers drafted cease and desist letters. Veterans shared horror stories turned triumphs. Even Karen's daughter, Emily, joined the effort, using her inside knowledge of HOA tactics to help identify red flags before they escalated. Watching her sit side by side with Sarah, two young women united by a shared mission, I couldn't help but marvel at how far we'd come. Redemption wasn't easy, but it was possible. And sometimes it started with a simple apology. Then came the call that made James smile in a way I hadn't seen since before his deployment. On the other end of the line was a retired Navy SEAL named Marcus, calling from Florida. His HOA had recently banned his service dog, claiming it violated some obscure pet policy buried deep in their rulebook. "They think I'm gonna roll over and leave," Marcus growled, his voice rough but determined. "But I served 20 years defending this country. I'm not backing down now." James leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk as he listened. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm but firm, the voice of a man who knew exactly what needed to be done. "Marcus," he said, "send me everything you've got. By tomorrow morning, we'll have a plan." As he hung up the phone, I caught the unmistakable glint of excitement in his eyes. For James, this wasn't just another battle. It was a chance to remind the world that veterans weren't just soldiers. They were leaders, strategists, and, above all, protectors. That night, as I sat on the porch watching Sophie chase fireflies in the yard, I thought about how much had changed. What started as a personal tragedy had grown into something far greater, a movement. Houses rebuilt, laws rewritten, lives reclaimed. And yet, the real victory wasn't in the battles won. It was in the lives touched along the way. Emily finding redemption. Sarah learning resilience. Neighbors rediscovering the power of community. Even Karen, sitting behind bars somewhere, served as a cautionary tale about greed and unchecked ambition. James stepped outside then, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one and nodded toward the horizon, where the first stars of the evening sparkled against the darkening sky. "You know," he said, sipping his drink, "sometimes losing your home teaches you what truly matters. It's not the walls or the roof. It's the people who build them and the memories they create together." I smiled, knowing he was right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fights, and undoubtedly new villains trying to exploit those who served. But James? He wasn't afraid. After all, he'd faced down warlords, terrorists, and yes, even Karen Matthews. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. Justice always found its way home. And so, as the cicadas sang their nightly serenade and the lights of Memorial Park twinkled in the distance, James picked up his phone, dialed Marcus back, and began plotting his next move. This time, though, he wasn't alone. Across the nation, thousands of voices stood ready to join him, each one a testament to the enduring spirit of those who refuse to let greed win. Sometimes, the greatest victories aren't the ones that end the war. They're the ones that inspire others to keep fighting.